Hello, welcome to our presentation, Smart Decarbonization of the Built Environment in the Nexus of Climate Change, Population Growth, and Technology Adoption. Next, please. Like all of the FSET projects, this is an interdisciplinary team, in this case between the School of Engineering, the School of Architecture, and the School of Public Affairs, as you can see here. Starting with Zoltan Nagy from the Cockrell School of Engineering, myself from the School of Architecture, Ariana Beck from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Cale Reeves, also from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Next, please. Buildings have a large impact on climate change. Roughly 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions stem from buildings, mostly from heating and cooling. So we're looking at how we can address this. Next, please. We know that cities are the place to deal with reducing emissions, but there's no way to easily gauge the impact at the city scale of the combination of strategies that are needed. Next, please. Very few tools exist to project expected emissions for combinations of decarbonization scenarios. For this reason, we've developed a framework that can project expected emissions that would arise from various development and decarbonization strategies combined. We call these impact pathways. And you can see this work through the links at the bottom of the screen as a paper, and also we have a dashboard. We know that decarbonizing the built environment involves these 4 areas: electrification of end use, such as heating and cooling, high efficiency HVAC and lighting, local photovoltaic generation, and grid decarbonization. Next, please. But while we know this, the question arises: what are the combined impacts? How do they compare to each other? And which one or combination of strategies are most effective? For example, if we want to have high efficiency HVAC systems, how do we incentivize that? How do we encourage people to adopt high efficiency HVAC or PV? And how do we support that with policies? It's clear we need to incentivize these, but it's not clear also what that impact would be. If we look at grid decarbonization, we don't know how fast it will happen realistically, or how fast is fast enough to deal with the problems of climate change. So we're looking at the implications of that at different timescales and in combination with other strategies. So once we do this, we need to also consider climate change will increase our energy demand. So it can counteract the impact of efficiency measures because the energy demand increases so much. For example, with hotter summers, we're going to have increased cooling loads. Finally, we can adopt these technologies, but when looking at climate change 10 to 40 years from now, it's important to look at how the city evolves over time and how that evolution and shape of the city itself also impacts emissions. There are other issues one could look at, but we chose for now to look at these 4. Our goal was to create a model that allows us to create scenarios for these 4 different topics: technology adoption, grid mix, climate change, and urban development scenarios, how they interact with each other, what are the trade-offs of some of the interactions, and what could be synergies. In particular, how does technology adoption compare to urban growth or zoning strategies for reducing carbon emissions? So I'll walk you through the model step by step, and you can also look at the paper to see more details. So first we created models for 3 different neighborhoods here in Austin: Brentwood, South Manchac, and Montopolis. And we're interested in their emission pathways all the way up until the year 2100. So starting at the policy level, if you look at the top figure, we can see that it has an impact on zoning, but also on mandates and incentives towards technology adoption. And then you can also see the maps showing the different development patterns, whether we include high density, which would mean including multifamily housing, multi-use buildings, or if those neighborhoods rather continued with business as usual and continued in a low density growth scenario. And you can see in the figure on the right the impact that each of those strategies would have. And we used the urban planning software Envision Tomorrow in order to develop these scenarios. Okay, next, please. Also important to note is at the building scale, the buildings are redeveloped over time based on the improvement to land value ratio. So there are 2 scenarios, and the way they dynamically change is based on this land to value ratio. For the technology adoption, as you can see here, there's an agent-based model that decides to adopt any of these technologies based on either incentives or mandates that are in place. It makes the decision based on 2 possible scenarios. And we look at these in terms of one, which would be trying to incentivize that people would adopt these technologies, and the other scenario would not incentivize. Next, please. So as the parcels of land are redeveloped into new buildings every year, we then model and simulate the available buildings in the neighborhood for any given climate scenario in order to calculate the energy demand of those buildings. For the buildings that have certain technologies, the energy demand is reduced accordingly. We looked at 3 different climate scenarios projected by the IPCC. We looked at A1B, A2, and B1. And as you can see from the figure on the right, the bottom B1 scenario is roughly on a pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100, and the others are looking at a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures by 2050 and 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. Next, please. So all energy is addressed electrically, which is a strong assumption that we make to keep things simple in our models. And then we convert the energy into carbon equivalent emissions based on a given scenario. And you can see the results in the graph at the right. If there's no change, the carbon emissions will remain what they are today. And the rapid adoption of alternative fuels for the grid mix would result in the bottom line you see in the figure. And so next I will switch over to my colleague, Dr. Zoltan Nagy.
Thank you, Dr. Felkner. I'm happy to be here and walk you guys through the results of our model. So to summarize the amount of scenarios that we had, you can see here we have 2 urban development scenarios, so more of a business as usual, low density, and the more aggressive high density development. Within those, there's 2 mandate scenarios, one that supports technology adoption, one that does not support it. And then within those, we have 3 climate scenarios and then 3 grid decarbonization scenarios. So it's a lot of data. I will show you a few slides of those. You're welcome to explore it in an online dashboard on this, and you can click on the QR code, or scan the QR code on your screen, or try to type the address, and then explore them individually. I'll give you the big sort of like takeaways that we found so far. If you could go to the next slide, please. So here you see all neighborhoods combined together. So it's representative somewhat from the city, if you will. The emissions, the annual emissions forecasted per unit, so per residence that we have, for one of the climate scenarios, which is A1B. So that's 1.5 C by 2050 or 2.5 C by 2100. And so the big picture takeaways, if we would go to the next slide, please. One is, if we manage to decarbonize the grid super fast, so the lowest, the fastest, the most rapid scenario, line A, you can see nothing else is included but grid decarbonization in a rapid way. That is a really, really good approach. Ways to do that, you may have heard yesterday in the keynote. It is a very aggressive approach, so it's also, maybe not going to happen is that fast. But that would be our best approach. In that case, everything else almost fades away, which is, one of the good news, because that is a big leverage in that sense. You can see, though, below that, there are 2 lines, and both of them are on the development side. And so the higher density development further pushes the emissions down. So that, in addition to the grid decarbonization itself. So it's supporting it positively. Next slide, please. A more realistic scenario is this moderate grid emission, because that means we're not getting all the way until net zero by 2050, essentially. And so we can see a little bit more interactions. One thing you see from all of these plots is that technology adoption basically has no impact in light of any other measures that we looked at. You can see the 3 plots often very close by. And so within these scales, they don't impact a lot. In this moderate scenario, something interesting happens, because you can see how the low density development, line C, decreases up until 2050, which is when grid decarbonization stops in our model, and then starts increasing again. So there is a rebound effect in the emissions, which is driven by both, building larger homes, larger single-family homes, McMansion style things, but also the energy demand increases because of climate change. And so this is something to keep in mind, that these things can happen. You see it a lot more pronounced on curve F, which has no grid decarbonization. So it goes down and then increases pretty rapidly to a level that is it at today. But on the other hand, you don't see it for the high density development in curve D. So in many ways, housing development, zoning policy is climate policy, and that's the takeaway message that I want to give away. We can take this further if we go to the next slide, please. We can look a little bit closer on the difference between the high and the low density development under climate change, for example. You can see that this happens for every scenario. The demand goes up, climate change amplifies the demand in terms of low density, for low density developments. And so we can compare the 2 directly, so we can derive the difference between the 2, and we dub that premium for sprawl. Next slide, please. So you can look at that directly and project it onto the development in the neighborhood. So here we equated the number of homes, so the number of units in each of the neighborhoods, to make sure that we compare apples to apples. So if you compare high density with low density, we want to have the same number of units for the same development, for different developments. And you can see on the right-hand side that it's tricky, because if you look at Brentwood, the neighborhood is old. It develops really slowly in our model until 2060. So the differences seem very little. But then again, as grid decarbonization might stop, and with the moderate approach, the middle curves for Brentwood, and climate change accelerates, the difference between the 2 are really big. So this compounding effect is something that we want to be aware of when we look at these climate scenarios, and also when we look at any other pathways or decarbonization scenarios. Simply just demand increase due to climate change and population growth is very often not accounted for, and it somehow magically works out. And so that's kind of like the message we're looking at. You see the difference between Brentwood and Montopolis being redeveloped a little bit faster, a little bit earlier, and so you can see those increases in the energy and the emission demand. And then grid decarbonization pushes it back down by 2050, and then again climate change will increase the demand substantially, and then make the difference between high and low density developments a lot more substantial. So next slide, please. There's a lot to explore, so you can click on that and drive home, look at the paper and look at the dashboard individually and what you're interested. And then you can generate questions. We generated a lot of questions after this, actually, so it's kind of a good research. I'm pretty proud of the big team. If you go to the next slide, I'll present you with the big conclusions. So one of the things is that between high and low density developments, we already know, transportation emissions are a lot smaller for low density neighborhoods. So here we also show that in general, the built environment is a lot better in terms of emissions for low density. This is directly linked to a recent policy. You have seen some cities have started to abolish exclusionary single family homes. So this came out at the same time as this work, and that puts directly the numbers to that and supports those kinds of policies. We want to have more of those and exclusionary as single family homes and minimum lot sizes and all that nonsense. So that's the first point. And we can project these forward and look at the interactions, because optimizing for scenarios is one thing. Trying to figure out how much magic technology we need to decarbonize the grid is one thing, but to see what actually is possible, we were quite surprised and shocked to see that tech adoption has such a little impact on the overall scale. And that's a big message here, to not to put your eggs into one basket, but try to see different technologies, different pathways, and evaluate them, what direction they're taking us. One thing to be aware of, which was also something we didn't expect, is a rebound effect. So depending on how your city develops and how you manage to decarbonize the energy emissions, you may actually turn things back along forward. You might put yourself onto a path today where you only see the effects in 30, 40 years, which is also something to be very, very aware of. I mentioned we need to think about climate change and all these emissions, because that's not going away. You all seen the report yesterday. Texas is one of the places that will have a huge impact on heating and drought, so that will drive up the demand, and that needs to be implemented and considered when we look at these forecast projections. There's no way to do it anymore without it. And then lastly, one thing that's really exciting about this project is that we do all these evaluations on a parcel level and even further on a residence level. So if there is a multifamily home on individual on one parcel, individual residences can have decisions, which means that we can implement any other indicator that could be evaluated for the future, like adoption of EVs. Every single of these residences may or may not have EVs. How quickly do they adapt? That's a simple model that has been studied, could be easily added here, and its implications on the demand and how quickly they are integrated into the city could be studied. Things like embodied carbon, when you do construction, when you rebuild the buildings, we have not looked at, but could be easily added because we have the developments of building by building. And then more fancy things like demand response, of course, also can be looked at. So I'll leave you with that. Please check out the paper, shoot us an email, like and subscribe, as the young kids say. And then, we're happy to hear from you. Thank you.